tonight. This is being recorded. So anyone who doesn't make it will be able to follow online on YouTube. This is a webinar that is quite special. It started as part of a Q&A with Milinda, in April, I think, or May. And we've been kind of figuring out a time when we can kind of slot this kind of session. It really, deals with the conversation about, it started with Modi and, initially, and the question about Modi and his public, so to speak. And I suppose, Milinda's work, Asfar's work, which we've read, these are the things which we were thinking with. I also read, I was lucky to read an early kind of conference note which is now a book that Asfar and Alan Strathern are coming out with next in spring, right? And I found that reading both Alan's book and the kind of the framework that they had for this conference and then volume, I thought that there's really a lot of food for thought. And I thought that, in the study of millenarianism in South Asia is really something that is, we are now paying attention to it in different religious traditions, but also comparatively, and thinking about what South Asia has to add to the study of millenarianism, kind of broadly. This is a kind of question that people didn't ask 20 years or more ago. Certainly when say someone like Norman Cohn was writing about the coming of the millennium, he wasn't thinking of South Asian examples and comparative kind of theorization and so on. And I think that's where some of those conversations in late spring, that is where it led me. Of course, in my own work, but also I think talking to Milinda, he's of course written this book which has these fabulous chapters about how sovereignty, kingship, millenarianism come together in the late colonial Bengal context. And again, there are all kinds of resonances with what Asper has written already in his book on the millennial sovereign. And I also think a lot of Pam and Errol, the work you've done on lords and bosses, questions of kingship, sovereignty in the longue durée in different parts of South Asia. So I think thinking across time and space is something that many of us have been doing in our own way, even if we've not necessarily kind of cohered around that one central concept of millenarianism, the millennium. So I guess what I want to do here is to introduce the four panelists and then let them, have their say for 10 minutes, and then we'll reconvene for a conversation. I'm just going to, if you don't know all of these people, I'm going to, Asfar Moin is in religious studies. He's in the department there. He's a historian of religion at UT Austin. Milinda Banerjee is a historian at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Edward Moonlittle is studying anthropology at the University of Cambridge. And Irene Pramod has just started her PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And as you'll hear from them, you'll realize what are the archives and field sites that they engage with, and they'll give us a little flavor of what they're doing. Keep in mind that this is a broader ERC initiative on the politics in the vernacular. And I'm sure one of the things that we'll talk about later on is what it means to study the millennium or millenarian movements in distinctive vernacular contexts in South Asia. And what's the place of the vernacular in all of this? This is, I guess, a common theme binding together all the different webinars and talks that we have. Okay, over to you, Asfar.
Thank you very much, Uday, and it's wonderful to join everyone here and looking forward to the conversation. So I'm assuming I'm going first because I work on the earliest period here. So, but that's good. So what I wanted to do was just to briefly sort of state how I ended up studying the millennium in Mughal India and sort of recast it in, as you said, political theological terms, and briefly reflect on it, just so that we could talk about it more later on. So. I think Uday, you really hit the nail on the head by saying that there really wasn't much work on millenarianism in South Asia especially when I was doing my PhD a while back. And I was the one, I had to read a lot of stuff, Khan and others on European history. But eventually when I began to look at what the Mughals had done, it struck me that, yeah, I mean, this was a classic case. When we normally think of millenarianism from a sociological perspective, we think, it's a social movement coming together, somebody's projecting a utopian ideal, sort of the cargo cult movements and so on. But the Mughal millennium happened the other way around. In fact, another sociologist once mentioned that it can be thought of as counter-millennialism in the sense that it was coming top down from the king. So what exactly went on there? So, we all know the history of Akbar, but one of the things to point out there is that Akbar faced a political theological problem right in the middle of his reign, right? First 20 years or so, all he was focused on was conquest, right? He was a heroic king. He was conquering left, right, and center. And he was making all sorts of pragmatic decisions as he was doing that. He wasn't giving much thought to them. So, for example, he starts to make Rajput alliances early on. He starts marrying into Rajput houses early on. Exactly in what nature, what was the ritual by which those marriages take place is actually a mystery to us. Nobody ever explains it, right? Because we know that the queens were never converted to Islam. So such marriages aren't really, valid under Islamic law. But Akbar didn't really care, right? He kept doing that. And once everything was pretty much stable, that is when a process of rationalization and self-reflection took place. That's, when he has religious debates done, and he tries a number of things. He tries to sort of project himself as a properly Islamic king, and he even tries to rationalize his Hindu marriages that way, and he realizes it is too constraining. And it's after that essentially, this was right around the turn of the Islamic millennium, and that is when essentially the millennial moment is used to present Akbar as a king who essentially was above the restrictions of any legal system, right? And this is sort of in some ways a classical definition of sovereignty that comes from the Schmidt tradition, which is how can you do away with an existing legal system and institute a completely new one, right? So the millennial moment was that Akbar was unveiled as the sacred, extremely sacred figure, the saint of the age, who essentially was inaugurating a new age, and the previous legal systems weren't necessarily suspended, but they were essentially subordinated to the king's word. To put it in modern terms, we could say that this is when the Mughal Empire imposed the state ethic that overrode any particular scriptural ethic, right? And the reason it became so controversial is because to do that, he had to replace the oath, the religious oath, which is the oath of Islam, with essentially a new oath, an imperial oath. And that imperial oath also had, that we all know it was Allahu Akbar instead of, the profession of faith, and it had his name on it, in it, which of course, led to allegations that he had created his own religion, right? So today we remember that moment as, oh, Akbar's new religion, but the Mughal imperial sources never ever say that Akbar is creating a new religion. In fact, the word Deen-e-Ilahi is not mentioned anywhere in the imperial sources. It's in the accusations against him that the term comes up. So what exactly were the practical consequences? Well, the practical consequences were that the one expression that is spread throughout the Mughal imperial sources is Sulh-e-Kul, or peace with all religion. That was the name of the new state ethic, right? So in some ways, you needed the millennium to impose Sulh-e-Kul, or peace with all religions, right? Or essentially a new state ethic. So that in a nutshell is essentially the Mughal millennium explained in political theological terms. Now, the question is, why haven't we been able to take that seriously? Why didn't that become part of the modern nationalist historiography that has looked at this problem for such a long time? I mean, I'm not the first one to actually look at the issue of Akbar and religion. It's been written about, right? at least one new thing that I did was I actually looked at it comparatively and also in a connected fashion by looking at Safavid Iran first and said, look, much of the idiom that Akbar was using was actually coming from Iran and Central Asia. It did not exist in pre-Mughal India, right? That it was the sort of the big historical sort of insight that at least I discovered. It's like, yeah, to understand this, you have to actually go outside of South Asia to look at it. And of course, that also meant connecting Mughal history with history outside of India, which, you know, some people like and others don't. So, so the question is, what happens to its memory? Now, of course, you know, again, most of us know Indian historiography, you know, after the partition was largely written in a secular and even, you know, Marxist mode. So it was anything that smacked of religion or enchantment could not really be taken seriously. So Akbar is talked about as a proto-secular figure very proudly, but the fact that secularism was actually millennialism, you know, it was just too unpalatable to explain it that way. And of course, in Pakistan, where, you know, one religion was being privileged over all others, again, the figure was just too embarrassing. By that time, too tainted with accusations of heresy and apostasy to actually make sense of it. So that is why I think, because the current political theological frameworks don't really allow for this story to become part of one's national history. It's sort of floating in its own little historical space, as it were, and you know, it becomes more of a importance for comparative and historical discussions. Now, one can talk about it as to what happens, say, I mean, I've written about what happens to millenarianism in Pakistan, and I can comment about that. And in some ways, an encrypted form of the memory of Mughal millennialism lives on in Pakistan, but that's a longer discussion. I'll be happy to get into it if depending on you know what other comments are. So I'll stop here and allow the next panelist to speak.
Let's move over to Milinda.
First of all, warmest thanks to Uday for taking this up. I mean, I was absolutely enamored, as you know, by your own talk, and it's great to continue the dialectics. Thanks, obviously, to Anastasia for the platform, and lovely to see so many warm and friendly faces. So I just want to start with something that Asfar already began with, that millenarianism has often been seen as a kind of idiosyncratic, subaltern, you know, reaction of marginalized peoples, whereas, of course, they're equally top-down millenarianisms. And I mean, in a way, this goes back to, I mean, the earliest historical times. If you think of the Roman Empire, I mean, the advent of Augustus Caesar is celebrated by Virgil in very strong kind of arguably messianic millenarian terms. And of course, the kind of messianic ideologies that are floating in then Palestine and the whole Jesus cult emerges. I mean, it is a dialectic, obviously, between imperial top-down kind of prophecies and bottom-up kind of aspirations. But I think what's really interesting about the stretch between the 16th to the 20th century or the 21st century is really, again, that this dialectics intensifies, and on such a global scale. Because on the one hand, you have imperial states legitimizing themselves through messianic millenarian ideologies. And Asfar's work, Sanjay Subramaniam's, Cornel Fleischer, Catherine Baban, they have all shown how across the Eurasian stretch, from the Holy Roman Empire to the Ottoman Empire, to Safavid Iran, to India, you have connected ideologies of legitimizing essentially state formation through messianic kind of millenarian ideologies, whether it's Suleiman the Magnificent or it's Akbar or whoever. And of course, you have the same in the British Empire as well. I mean, one thing we often forget is how much actually the British imperial ideologues also used messianic millenarian ideologies. I mean, one very good example would be somebody like Stephen Fitzgerald-Stephen, who's studied by Eric Stokes. Stephen is, in the late 19th century, one of the big apologists for colonial racism, particularly in the aftermath of the Ilbert Bill controversy. And he imagines the advent of British rule in India, and particularly Victoria's imperial assemblage of 1877, as something akin to the messianic peace brought about by the birth of Christ. So he actually quotes Milton. And even people like, you know, Curzon, Lord Curzon, whom one might think as a very rational administrator, he uses very strong providential terms to think about the Delhi Darbar of 1903. So among British imperial administrators as well, there is a lot of kind of messianic millenarian kind of ideologies. Now, my broad argument, so let me come down to my theoretical argument. My theoretical argument is the reason messianism, millenarianism is so important in South Asia and across many other parts of the world between the early modern and modern periods is because of the globalization of the sovereign state form and the globalization of capitalist production and exchange. The globalization of the sovereign state form leads to enormous amounts of dialectics where both top-down states, as well as those resisting the states, but of course, any resistance is also in a way a mirroring, they use these very expansive messianic millenarian ideologies to legitimize themselves. So what the Mughal Empire does and how, let us say, the Sikhs or the Marathas mirrored many of those ideologies, it is a messianic dialectics. If one looks at, for example, the Shiva Bharata, this court epic produced at Shivaji's court with this wonderful translation and introduction by James Lane, it very much, I mean, when it talks about Shivaji as this messianic figure who comes down to fight against the demonic kind of Muslim rulers and so on, it is in many ways, of course, mirroring the prior moment of Mughal imperial state building. And of course, the same is true for the globalization of capitalist political economy, because what happens with capitalism, particularly, of course, with colonial capitalism, is an enormous kind of subalternization of communities, bringing various kind of peasant indigenous communities within the ambit of the state structure, and then extremely rigorous and brutal value extraction, extracting labor, resources, etc., from humans, from non-humans. And reaction to this kind of juggernaut leviathan of value extraction, of commodification, if you think of capitalism as the generalization of the commodity form, the reaction to this is, of course, also manifested through extremely expansive messianic ideologies, which cannot be understood in a purely localist subalternist lens. They have to be understood as products of a global colonial political economy. And, you know, right from the, and if you look at, for example, I mean, right from the first moment of British rule in India, from the late 18th, early 19th century, the Pagol Bidroho, which, you know, and other kinds of peasant revolts, onto, obviously, across the 19th century, I mean, I'm thinking, obviously, of Ranjit Guho's work, into the 20th century of so many peasant revolts. But I think that there's a very fundamental transformation in the political vocabulary of the peasant revolt, which is not some kind of aboriginal, indigenous, subaltern millenarianism, but it's actually a reaction to state and capital. And I mean, Yele is here, obviously his work shows how in the Naga case as well, these enormous translocal pre-Christian and then Christian messianisms that erupt in the 20th century are in many ways unprecedented. They are a reaction to this kind of state-capital nexus. Now, in my own work, what I basically also showed is you have these messianic political vocabularies at multiple levels. You have it in order to legitimize the creation of the Hindu-Indian national state. I mean, if you look at a figure like Bankim Chandra, who is undoubtedly the most important Indian writer of the 19th century, I mean, for him, I mean, the figure of Krishna is not just, you know, a political figure. It's also a messianic figure who represents both the kind of Shmitian constituent moment of creation of Indian national sovereignty in the Mahabharata war, but also he's an avatar who embodies the coming into presence of the nation to come. So, I mean, and if you look at, you know, novels like Anandamot, Devi Chaudhurani, there is a strong anti-Muslim Hindu millenarianism, which is particularly tied into the usage of mantras and, you know, hymns about Kalki and so on, like the Mlechani Vahanidane Kalayasi Karavalang of Jayadeva and so on. In Devi Chaudhurani as well, this woman is portrayed as a millenarian avatar of Krishna who comes in order to fight the British. But by the early 20th century, of course, you also have this mingling then with the kind of global moment of the Ottoman Empire, the Khilafat movement, and especially the Russian Revolution. So if you look at a figure like Qazi Nazrul Islam, who is, I mean, obviously one of the most important Indian thinkers of the 20th century, he hybridizes vocabularies about Qiyamah, the Islamic end time, with Pralaya, the Sanskritic end time, with the communist idea of revolution. So for him, popular revolution is Qiyamah and Pralaya. And I mean, he's the first to translate the Lante Nacional into Bengali, where he again uses avataric imageries to think about how the proletariat, the Shorbohara, is going to rise up against the British. And of course, if it's so, I mean, both at elite as well as, you know, at these multiple levels, whether it's Hindu national state building, whether it's Islamico-Hindu communism in the Nazrul Islam mode, or it's various kinds of Hindu ascetic sectarian kind of nationalism, like the Bharat Sevashram Shango, which is a very enormous influence on Shama Prasad Mukherjee, the founder of the Jansang, or obviously the whole Pakistan movement. I mean, if you look at the pamphlets which circulated in the Bengal countryside legitimizing the Pakistan movement, it's about, God's kingdom coming. If you look at figures like Muhammad Ali and his court trial records, I mean, the court trial is, of course, a messianic moment where Muhammad Ali looks at this portrait of the king emperor and says, God's kingdom has come right now. And that means I'm free from, all bonds of earthly sovereignty. So the idea that Qiyamah has come, Pralaya has come, God's kingdom has come right now, this is something you find from the very local peasant villages across South Asia onto, nationalist texts, and so on. And this creates, I think, and ultimately I would basically argue, to wrap up, that we cannot understand Indian political thought, whether at the level of elite canonical intellectuals or at the level of Gandhian nationalism. I mean, Gandhi himself, as Shahid Amin, of course, has said, was himself constructed messianically. Just look at a novel like Thorai Chorit Manush of Shotinath Bhaduri, which shows the tension. Or you look at the Naxalite rebellion, which often actually uses very strong Hindu apocalyptic imageries latent within the critique of capitalism, and also creating this whole idea of the new man in the new world, Notun Manush, Notun Dunia. So right up to today's kind of Maoist movements, and EL's work shows that the Naga movements and so on, South Asian politics as part of the global political plane has been deeply imbued with millenarian currents, imbued with different traditions. But ultimately, I would say what holds it all together is this enormous dialectics of state formation and capitalist value extraction, and the way that different reactions happen at different levels, from middle class levels to local levels. I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. Lots of very provocative and interesting ideas there. And I think already we are seeing the question of millenarianism as movement, and the question of millenarianism as a basis of sovereignty. But also it goes back to something I just want to flag here, something that Pam and Dave Gilmartin and other people have they've edited a volume. I just want to shout out about that, is that, this question of the conundrum of sovereignty and the relationship with legitimacy. This seems to be something that, across time seems to be, faced by rulers, but also by subjects in some ways. What constitutes legitimacy, and how do you legitimize sovereignty? Anyway, but I'll just, let's go to Ed and Irene, and then we'll kind of have a conversation.
Screen. There we go. All right. So I was working on Manipur in the Imphal Valley for my ethnographic research, and my interlocutors used certain phrases to talk about a change of time. So Langon Longdai, it draws on, it's like a change of generations, but the word Langon can also be used for avatars. So it's quite a hard concept to translate if we're thinking with vernacular idioms of millenarianism. And then Bakangba Amuk Halakani is much more straightforward, like I halake is like I have returned. It's just Bakangba will return. And Bakangba is this the first king on the most well-known Metis chronicle, and he's also a deity, widely worshipped in the late 20th century. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to talk. One of the things I liked about this, the idea of doing this panel and the comparative element, and we just had this tour de force from Milinda, is to bring back some of this comparative focus that's been lost a little bit on the writing of Northeast India, that a lot of the millenarian movements have kind of been siloed in stories of particular nationalisms. So I was thinking back to this book, Godman on the Warpath by Stephen Fuchs, and it's got some problems in, and Architong Longkum has deconstructed quite generously, though, some of the problems as it talks about Naga nationalism. But in the 1920s, 1930s, 1910s, there's a messianic sort of movement amongst Manipuris, amongst the Nagas, the Manipuris, the Metis, and the Cookies. And these have kind of been forgotten, the millenarian aspects in, for example, the Cookie one, it's focused on a story of Cookie nationalism and a sort of magical Meti Raja to be that's in the historical sources is now kind of omitted. So I worked with a group of Meti-speaking people, Metalon-speaking people, who I call revivalists, and they are from kind of the lower and middle classes of Manipur. The Meti were the dominant community in the pre-colonial Manipuri polity, And they are kind of in the 20th century, though they feel greatly weakened by immigration, by affirmative action, by lots of changes. And to understand their millenarianism, they have a really strong sense of rupture, a really abrupt sense of rupture, that there's a golden age where the kingly chronicle starts. People often said 33 AD, which is the date given in the chronicle, to 1701. And that's when things went badly. So there's a story about a Brahmin who came from Bengal, who got the kings of Manipur and made them convert to Vaishnava Hinduism, particularly Gauriya Hinduism, of the type known in Bengal at the time. And now for Meti revivalists, this is a really much reviled moment. Everyone mentioned this guy on the left, Shantidas Gosai, and this is a play about this awful moment, and a play done by one of Manipur's most famous actors, who's played everything from Hitler, Bin Laden, to folk heroes in these like Meti language plays. So this is the moment it all goes wrong. And out of the things the Brahmin did, Shantidas Gosai, he's said to have burned the holy manuscripts that contained a lot of knowledge, a lot of indigenous knowledge for the Meti, and it's widely commemorated across Manipur. People hold events that commemorate the burning, there's public art about it. It's become, although it's hard to trace historically, it's become a very important part of how people remember the past. In the late 19th century, in the neighboring province of Kachar in Assam, a guy called Narayana Fullo rose up and he thought he could recover. He had dreams from the gods. He talked about recovering some of these lost puyas, rediscovering this lost indigenous knowledge. And this is kind of a millenarian movement that happens, but has largely been disconnected from the Kuki and the Naga movements. And it's a reform movement that happens in Manipur. And the descendants of it, this group called Apokpa Marup, Marup meaning Society of Friends, is still very popular today. And then these puyas, people have secret puyas in their houses. There's certain odors of it. You know, here's a YouTube video where people talk about the puyas containing prophecies even for Corona. So that is one of the ways millenarianism happens in contemporary Manipur, is the claims that people have certain manuscripts, and these manuscripts have this tremendous knowledge. And that is what builds up this millenarianism. And unlike historians, you know, anthropologists, we sit with the millenarians. We drink their tea, we eat their biscuits, we sit on their sofas. And there's kind of an awkward relationship between anthropologists and millenarians. And I take this idea from Joel Robbins. And what millenarians achieve without too much difficulty is a deep commitment to a new picture of the world. You know, they're ready to change it, they're ready to work for it, they open themselves up for a possibility of different life. Anthropologists, you know, we're very good at critiquing things, but if anyone asks us how the world should be, we're less good. And I think at saying how it should be, you know, we could talk about decolonizing something, and then people might ask, what do you want in its place? And then we're out, we're gone. You know, it's very hard to say, put forward a vision of what life should be like. But we're quite good at looking at different forms of life and different ways of living in the world and comparing them and seeing the good in different forms, which millenarians don't tend to be, right? The world at the moment is very bad and we need a new world, and they're working towards it. So there's kind of this awkward relationship between the two. So this is the image of Pakangba, some of the many images of Pakangba. And with my time, I will just quickly talk about one or two interlocutors. So Bala is a Meti woman in her 50s. She's been freed from the responsibility of childcare and has become a sort of religious activist. She blamed the increase in car crashes in Manipur on a growing number of Suroi Noroi. And these are the sort of bad spirits that are propitiated each Meti New Year, that plague humanity, that keep our numbers down. You know, they're really awful things. And there's a lot of car crashes in Manipur along the Loktak Road, the road to Loktak Lake in the hills. And she says they've grown up in numbers. And that if Pakangba will return soon to sort this out, you know, he'll return and bring a better world. So Bala is interested in this very kind of, you know, cosmological issue, but she's also very interested about the division of Manipur, the loss of the territorial unity due to threats from the Naga nationalist movement, from Kuki nationalist movements. She travels to Assam and works with Meti communities there. Her problems of the Naga nationalists, movements that Yeli Wooters talks about. So she's a real activist as well. And what gives her the confidence in her millenarian beliefs is that she's visited in her dreams by a Metis goddess, Ima Limerel, who has been known, as long as we have these ethnographic records on the Metis, really located with dreaming. So she gets her revelations from dreams, and then she goes out and does ritual work throughout the landscape and political work, challenging the claims of other groups that will divide up Manipur. A second group of interlocutors used to belong to the Universal Friendship Organization. And I think another theme we see is like millenarian ideas of universal peace. This is a very big organization still, perhaps a little more popular 10, 20 years ago. They have these campuses across Manipur, and a few members of that, or people who've just left that, also they used to talk about Pakangba returning, Pakangba Amuk Halakini, and they talk about various prophecies and puyas, and about this is the time that Pakangba will return. And they have a very, very focused list of how they will make Manipur better, from everything from collecting 100 ponies, to do with preserving the Metis pony, to kind of building their own stock exchange and trading networks. And they have their, very much their own way of seeing things. And as a subaltern movement, when they originally formed, they wouldn't let in Raj Kumars or some of the higher members of Metis society. It was kind of very much a lower tier group in Manipur. I think they probably have about 100,000 members, and they kind of stretch into Assam. They started trying to launch an office in Bangladesh, Myanmar, wherever the Metis community is. So this is two kind of ways I work with people with very distinct millenarian ideas. And here they are in a parade day, looking at this image of Pakangba on top of the world. So all kind of decked out in their official Universal Friendship Organization uniform. So I thought one of the interesting things is that in the news this week, this American organization, Worshippers of World Peace and Unification Sanctuary, just bought this kind of big lot of land in Tennessee for their own, leaning heavily on militarized imagery, but also talking about world peace. And the final point I want to move on to is that my Metis interlocutors, they might talk about spirits, they might talk about dreams, return of Pakangba, but they are really just one of many millenarian impulses in Manipur at the moment. So this week we have some more of the Kuki community, have returned to Israel as a lost tribe. So that's from the 13th of October, great photo. ISKCON obviously talks about the Kali Yuga with a particular intensity, that's ISKCON Info. And many of my Naga friends were caught up in QAnon. And maybe this is one of the first times this millenarian impulse, affects Britain, America, and the highlands of Central Asia all together. So yeah, they might be millenarians, but also they're kind of one of many millenarian impulses in Manipur at the moment. And Michael Hennice has been working on the neighboring Konyak groups in Nagaland who have their own prophet and their own millenarian movement. So kind of one of many.
Okay, thank you so much, Ed. And again, lots of questions, which we'll have to keep for a bit. Over to you, Irene, last but not least.
Thank you so much, Uday, and thank you so much for the invitation. I really, I'm very happy to be here. So today I'll be looking into the politics of emergent forms of millenarianism among people who circulate in and out of South Asia. A trans-regional approach to the study of millenarianism, I suggest, can help us understand how distinct forms of millenarianism emerge as people move along shared but uneven circuits of mobility, drawing on what Doreen Massey has called the differentiated mobility of privileged and less privileged subjects. I ask, how do the millenarian theologies of dominant and subaltern groups in South Asia come to interact with each other in new urban locales overseas? Today, I focus on the historically subordinated Pentecostal Christians and the dominant caste indigenous Syrian Christians who have, since the 1970s, moved in considerably large numbers from Kerala in South India to the oil-rich Persian Gulf in search of work. I'm interested particularly in a widespread and contentious phenomenon among Kerala Christians in the Gulf that is little known outside the region, namely the conversions or parivartanangal of dominant caste Syrian Christians to millenarian forms of charismatic Christianity that have historically been associated with subaltern and ex-slave converts in Kerala. I start with a quote excerpted from my field notes. I was blind, inike karcha ilayirno, but the Holy Spirit saved me from darkness. Irital ninna parishudatmava ine viduvichu. Sajib passed after these words with defiant conviction, almost in rebuke to my sustained inquiry into what he termed his conversion, parivartanam, from his ancestral Syrian Christian background to Pentecostalism in the mid-1980s when he first arrived in Qatar for work. Indeed, his account of being divinely rescued from his Syrian Christian past echoed what I heard from other Malayali self-proclaimed pastors in Qatar, all of whom are Syrian Christians, but have since their arrival in Qatar turned to Pentecostalism as pastors of their own new-founded churches. To a Pentecostal Christian anywhere, Sajib Pastor's words wouldn't seem unusual or extraordinary in the least. The pre-conversion past is retrospectively signified as a time of darkness, irita, a past from which the Pentecostal convert is saved and now seemingly severed from. Anthropologists of Christianity, including Joel Robbins, have debated what the proverbial rupture or break with the past means for Pentecostal converts who have in recent decades proliferated worldwide. But in the context of Kerala, where Christianity has long been a purveyor of caste politics, Sajib Pastor's relegating of his Syrian Christian self to some distant sinful past does not simply represent another instance of Pentecostal rupture in the post-colonial present. Instead, as I will show, it shares an uncanny resonance with millenarian ideas of temporal change and spiritual transformation that first emerged among subaltern converts in colonial Kerala. During and after the Protestant missions in Kerala in the 19th and 20th centuries, Pentecostal and charismatic forms of Christianity became what V.V. Thomas calls a new religion for Dalit and ex-untouchable castes, a religion that emerged among subaltern groups in direct opposition to their Syrian Christian overlords. The historian Sanal Mohan tells us that the conversion of slave castes to Protestant forms of Christianity posed one of the most significant challenges to the traditional caste and political order of colonial Kerala. New charismatic and millenarian movements emerged among these subaltern converts, such as those led by Poige Yohannan, with visions of social equality and liberation from caste oppression at their core. Indeed, as the anthropologist Chris Fuller argues, these histories of caste slavery and conversion have sundered the Christian populations in Kerala into distinct castes in their own right, with the landowning Syrian Christians at the top of this caste hierarchy and the Pentecostal converts at the bottom, and with each group embodying a Christianity in social and moral opposition to the others. At the same time, we know from historiographies of Pentecostal church formation in Kerala that Syrian Christians have often occupied leadership and patronage positions in Pentecostal churches, although the inverse was never possible. Even from this brief, scattershot, broad-brushed historical overview, I hope we can get a sense of the messy career of Christianity in Kerala vis-a-vis its caste politics. And if we now return to Sajib Pastor's account of Pentecostal salvation and deliverance, Virudal, we might ask, wherein lies the appeal of Pentecostalism to dominant caste Syrian Christians in the Gulf? Sajib Pastor's weekly church services, which I attended on a number of occasions, might provide some answers. Preaching to nearly 200 congregants across caste and class lines, from middle-class accountants to construction workers, Sajib Pastor took on a different persona on stage. He riddled his sermons with sudden bursts of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, called Anya Basha, a Pentecostal ritual experience characterized by Holy Spirit possession. In these liminal moments of perceived spontaneity, the congregation too erupted in ecstatic worship, as Sajib Pastor proceeded to lay hands on those who sought healing and financial breakthrough. After the onset of COVID-19, Sajib Pastor began to issue 30-day fasts for the church, prophesying divine protection against the virus and allaying fears of unemployment among his congregants, while also urging them to stay vigilant against the plans of the devil, as the second coming of Christ was believed to draw imminently near. While everything I've described so far falls well within the bounds of the Pentecostal ordinary, it is remarkable that by Sajib Pastor's own admission, these are aspects of Pentecostal religiosity that he, like other Syrian Christian pastors in Qatar, was once deeply averse to. The Holy Spirit, Parishuddhatma, that he now invokes with fondness and reverence in his sermons and possession rituals, was once the object of his derision in Kerala, with the spirit possession rituals themselves characterized as exclusively subaltern, most certainly raucous, and fundamentally un-Christian by Syrian Christian Orthodox standards. We can now see why Saji Pastor understood his pre-conversion past as a time of darkness, irita. The Holy Spirit, Parishuddhatma, that he once derided, is now, he believes, the reason for his salvation. The ritual spirit possessions that he once mocked as a subaltern, un-Christian practice are what he now initiates himself in his own church services. What I suggest is at play here is a mimetic politics of millenarianism among dominant caste Syrian Christians, an emulation of subaltern charismatic practices and millenarian discourses, even as these dominant groups vie for the promises of neoliberal capitalism in the Gulf. Promises of neoliberal prosperity are deeply uncertain, producing what the Komarovs have called a global economy of desire that is at once almost within reach, yet often lost from one's grasp. Amidst this neoliberal uncertainty emerges a distinct kind of millenarian project in which the individual is upended from traditional webs of security, particularly in unfamiliar urban settings overseas. The sociologist Abdul Malik Simon tells us that the impersonal, often alienating conditions of urban life in rapidly globalizing cities lead its residents to follow an ethos of conviviality, an ethos that Simone suggests is found in Pentecostal visions of collective salvation and revivalist transformation. At the same time, as anthropologists have argued, the intimacies of urban life in contemporary South Asia and its Indian Ocean hinterlands are fraught with conflict along caste and class lines. Dominant and historically subordinated groups now find themselves staking competing claims to middle classness and upward mobility as aspiring neoliberal moderns. But in trying to become what Simone calls socially visible agents of change, dominant groups such as the Syrian Christians draw on the millenarian undercurrents of subaltern Pentecostal Christianity to forge new prosperity cults premised on gospels of material and spiritual salvation. Indeed, the moral horizons that emerge from their urban millenarian theologies attempt to rework paths of contempt and retrospectively sinful tradition into futures of messianic possibility and neoliberal promise. Now, end there.
Thank you so much, Irene. That was fantastic. I just, so we have about 15 minutes or so. If you want to ask questions of each other, or you kind of want to follow up, given what you've heard, because there are all these really exciting overlaps and ways in which all of you've been speaking to each other without actually, implicitly, without actually intending to do so. So if anyone wants to go, and we can open it up, to be honest, we have 45 minutes overall. Okay, I actually have a question for all of you, which I've been waiting to ask is, some of you, you pointed to the conundrums raised as we heard in the last instance, by colonial political economy, and by the conditions of Islamic rule in a predominantly non-Islamic society, or where oaths and other arrangements have to be made to secure the legitimacy of the sovereign. But also there are other aspects which link to the conundrum of sovereignty and legitimacy. On the one hand, the other set of issues has to do with the conundrums of the self. And this goes down right to the everyday, and it could be in folk or indigenous religions, which, or the kind of the urban forms of displacement that you see in the Gulf or in other Indian cities. There are ways in which the notions of interiority, questions of, the anthropology of ethics, which come up, which is about how ought we to live our lives, essentially. When we kind of think of the impending millennium. And that is a question that perhaps Akbar had to face too, but certainly, when you think about your Syrian Christian interlocutors in the Gulf, they too have to answer the same question at one level. And so one of the things which I want to kind of ask all of you is this question of the self and the question of sovereignty. What sometimes seem as the question of the self sometimes might seem on the surface to be one of interiority. And perhaps it is at one level, but it is also at the other, in another sense, a conundrum of sovereignty. And I wonder, what are the ways in which, the everyday and the epochal come to be linked in the different kind of notions of the millennium, the different, what I'm trying to also do is go beyond the idea of millenarianism as simply a movement or as a moment, because there are many ways in which, the people you're talking about are domesticating the millenarian moment. And there is a way in which there is a kind of almost institutionalization. And there is something very everyday about how it is experienced and the solutions that are being sought, whether in the form of oaths or whether in the form of certain charismatic prayer practices. So sorry, I'm just going to leave it at that. And we have a lot of hands up. So whoever wants to, if you want to answer this, or we can open it up. Yeah.
I've had my hand. Oh, Melinda.
Okay, Milinda, sorry, Milinda and Ed had their hands up, yeah.
I just wanted to respond, Uday, to your very interesting point. I think you're absolutely right. When one focuses on Messianism and Millenarianism, traditionally one often tends to focus on like the public sphere. But what is the kind of messianic self that is produced? What is the messianic subjectivity and interiority? It's not just about the coming of the Mahdi or the Mujaddid or the Avatara. It's also about becoming Avatara, becoming a Mujaddid. And I just want to take 3 case studies from colonial India, which I think are very interesting. One is, of course, Bankim Chandra, because Bankim Chandra is not just talking about Krishna as an avatara who's going to come. He's also training the admittedly middle class Bengali subject, or at least Indian subject, but both man and woman, on how to become an avatara. And Devi Chaudharani is actually a novel which is about how to become an avatara through Onushilan, through particular physical, mental, spiritual characteristics. And this template is actually enormously influential on anti-colonial Indian revolutionaries, to the extent that one of the most famous revolutionary militant organizations, Onushilan Shomiti, gets its name from these pedagogic techniques of how to become a messianic form. But also, if we look at Rajbongshis, for example, so when the Rajbongshis in northern Bengal, they are also thinking of themselves as like Krishna's avatara. So one thing that comes repeatedly in their writings is just as Krishna in the Gita promises to defeat the evil and do dharma samsthapan, similarly, we will defeat the evil and do dharma samsthapan. But that also means that in their own interiority, through rituals, through new forms of conduct, male-female relations, human-cattle relations, new forms of sociality, they actually cultivate a kind of ethicalized understanding of the self to make themselves into a lawmaking subject, which coincides with the time when in the 1920s and 30s, they are also claiming reservations. They're saying that, there should be reservations, they are allying with Ambedkar and all of that. But in order to say we are sovereign lawmaking subjects, they're also producing very ethicalized selves. And the final point I just want to take with Nazrul Islam. So obviously, as many of you would know, in the 15th, 16th century, at the time when the Byzantine Empire is attacked by, is under attack from the Ottomans, there exists a lot of kind of messianic prophecies that when Rome falls, the Mahdi is going to come. And these are resurrected in the 1910s, when from the Bengal countryside, you have these rumors circulating that when Constantinople falls or when Jerusalem falls, the Mahdi is going to come. Now, Nazrul Islam picks up on these to basically talk about, to say anybody is a potential Mahdi, anybody is a potential Kalki, anybody is a potential Messiah. Now, what that means is if anybody is a potential Kalki or Mahdi, they should produce solidarities with similar other subjects, and particularly with other subaltern suffering subjects. So especially kind of pastoralists, peasants, prostitutes, fishermen, and so on. And the kind of socialist subjectivity that he actually forms is actually a deeply messianic millenarian subjectivity. It is the idea that in a way it is the solidarity of every potential messiah, including both men and women, to come together. So I think these kinds of ethicalized selfhood, and if we look at a later stage like the Naxalite movement, again, in the Naxalite rebellion, there is so much of a focus on how to produce ethical selves. I think this has been traditionally quite neglected in scholarship, and we absolutely need to know this. And I'm very curious about today's ethnographic reality, that whether among Hindu nationalism or among Maoism, among with different kinds of Dalit Adivasi movements, whether these kinds of ethicalized messianic selves, I'm sure, are being produced, as Ed Stock kind of hints at. And I think that kind of ties the self and sovereignty within, again, a very interesting global frame.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Ed and Irene.
Just lower my hand. Yeah, I'd say that the two groups would have very different answers. So Bala got to an age where a lot of women, like a postmenopausal age, from this kind of belt of like Manipur, Assam, all the way down to Southeast Asia, are at risk of becoming spirit mediums. She had a really bad series of possession where she couldn't eat, she was really sick, nothing could heal her for 3-4 weeks. Instead of becoming a spirit medium and leaving the role of a householder, she managed to retain it. But she has a very porous idea of the self and sovereignty, where the goddess comes into her mind and tells her what to do. So the balance between herself and what the goddess wants has become, very porous, and the goddess comes into her mind, speaks with her, and gives her a lot of vision. The members of the UFO, now if you went to near where I lived in my fieldwork in Imphal and went to a branch of the UFO, they're sitting on the floor, they're listening to the radio, they're smoking really big joints because they think marijuana helps bring brotherhood between people. And they're trying to move away from that now. And during an interview with one person, he was explaining the official position that they've left marijuana as a way of having control over the self to stop fighting in a very conflict-riven place. But as he was talking, he's lifting up his jumper because it was a hot day, and underneath was a massive marijuana leaf on his t-shirt. And we had a little laugh that they may not have moved on so successfully, but they take a very different idea to sovereignty over the self, that they practice a martial art that they don't teach to non-members called Tangta, a version of Tangta, and they medicate through marijuana, so that they put a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of practices into maintaining the sovereignty of themselves. But both interlocutors would not see themselves as avatars at all. They'd be very keen to move themselves away from that.
Very interesting. Irene?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond very quickly to, I think, one of those last questions that you posed about the domestication of millenarian movements, because I'm still starting out on my whole PhD things. I'm still figuring out my way. But one thing that I'm thinking through is about the kinds of millenarianism that emerge and that are pre-existing among elite groups, elite dominant groups like the Syrian Christians themselves, and trying to not see millenarianism as something that just emerges among these Pentecostal groups, because it's often been sort of associated with Pentecostalism and ideas of rupture and the kinds of millenarian apocalyptic ideas of the future and all of that comes along with it. But something that I'm thinking through is the millenarianism of the dominant Christians, of the Syrian Christians themselves, as brought about by the Church of the East, and how, and everything from prayers for the dead to ideas of the kingdom coming soon and having a secure future in that kingdom. These are all parts of dominant caste Syrian Christian millenarian theology and thought. And so my question then is, when they move away from their South Asian context to a Gulf city, whether it's Doha, Dubai, Kuwait City, or wherever, when they come to these places, why is it then that the Syrian Christian forms of millenarianism lose meaning? Or is it because the Syrian Christian forms of millenarianism, they aren't temporally up to speed with the demands of the neoliberal present in the Gulf? Is it because the Pentecostal millenarianism offers something more that's more temporally up to speed and in tandem with with a rapid economic and socio-political situation in rapidly globalizing cities. And so I suppose whether or not millenarianism is domesticated or if it's an amalgam of two or more kinds, this is something that I'm kind of thinking through. And if there is a domestication, the question of why one particular kind of millenarianism comes to dominate the scene, even as others are pre-existing and in the background.
That is very interesting, and especially, it raises I think it was something that perhaps to think about is the question of whether the metaphysitism in the Church of the East has some kind of incipient millenarian kind of element which is being suddenly reactivated in this particular context. But anyway, that is a kind of Anastasia and Francesca are waiting very patiently. Anastasia?
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very exciting, very interesting. Now, I'm thinking that, of course, millenarianism is part of a very particular vision of the world, both of time in the way that it takes its course and of the universe at large, which has a linearity and which has a finality. So, it's something that comes at the end if we get rid of all the details, whether it's a millennium or a longer. And it also has someone or something at the top, which is why the idea of a sovereign above the law, someone who has the ultimate say over everything sort of fits into the scheme very, very comfortably. Now, I wonder what you will have to say about how that fits into the Hindu sort of standard of seeing time in the world, which is pretty circular. There's no ultimate anything, no king is above anything. He may represent the law, embody the law, but he's certainly not above it, which is why the idea of a sovereign makes sense as far that, this is a Mughal kind of introduction. And then, of course, Hindu kings started copying that. But it is a sort of imperial, Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic, shall we say, sort of idea. And I do wonder, one, how did it, what form did it take in the Hindu context, historically, but also perhaps, maybe there is a difference between a sort of Hindu millenarianism and what we're used to thinking of in, the Christian and also the Islamic context.
Do you want to, Francesca, let's get your question in and then we can kind of let everyone, ungag everyone.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating, and it's feel like you start seeing millenarians everywhere. It's like very very striking. I had two questions. One was that as you were speaking about your different aspects and topics. I mean, I thought belief, emotion, mobilizing self and others were sort of very strong elements, and I'm thinking all the work on politics of emotion that Margaret Pernau, for example, does, and then I thought, what is the in the cases that you're familiar with, what is the two aspects, what is the relationship of this, I suppose, aspect of the self or the vision of the world with other aspects that can be more rational or calculating or in fact even ironic, so the idea instead of enchantment, a kind of undermining, so irony and it's something that I intend to pursue. And I was thinking, Bankim Chandra, okay, he is what you are, Milinda, what you're saying, but he also writes the Kamala Canto, and he's also, supremely rational. So maybe it's our own, kind of, or my own mindset that, binary mindset, there's things or either belief or rationality or either emotion or belief or irony or so on. But in fact, I suppose that in the examples that you thinking Irene as well, or Ed, or it can't be it can't be just that the people that you work with. And so I was wondering, maybe ethnographically or from your observation, how do you see the shifting of registers, and when is one register activated and others, and also what their view of politics is, I suppose, does politics belong to the realm of belief and so mobilization and so on, or is it instead the realm that you think, oh well, no, these are all crooks and and dirty and nothing to do with I think that's my question.
Okay, we have a lot of answers now to these questions. Let's start with us for this time.
Yes, thank you. Let me just say something first to Anastasia's question. Of course, I'm no specialist of Hinduism, but one of the things I'd like to just point out is that Judeo-Christian Islamic ideas of the Mahdi or the Messiah really come from a general problem of what to do with essentially with the loss of kingship, right? So so essentially, I mean, one of the myths is that the true king will come in the future, right? That's how it's all started, essentially, with the loss of kingship in Israel. So in that sense, it's not very particular. I mean, it's a response that gets coded in scripture and hence becomes part of a scriptural tradition. But in general, it's a problem of what do you do with the loss of kingship, and basically say our king will come back and destroy all other kings in the future. And it's in that sense, it's a very it sort of maps onto a lot of other millenarians. And so that's one way of thinking about it. The other thing is that in the Mughal case, when you look at the comparative issue of Hinduism, I mean, of course, there is the myth of Rama that does come up. Now, its association with the law is not as clear cut as it is in the Abrahamic traditions, precisely because the form of political theology that takes shape in monotheism is very different from what it is in Hinduism. So I think that's really one comparative way of thinking about it. And and then to sort of switch gears and say something about Uday's question that I think relates a little bit to Francesca's as well, is that in the Mughal case, something very interesting happens to the idea of Solekol over the long durée. And this is something I've been working on. And in fact, there's a special issue on modern Asian study, in modern Asian study, that's going to come out early next year, that has a bunch of essays that respond to it. But the short of it is that generally people say, well, Solekol just ends with Akbar and Jahangir, and so it's not such a big deal. But in fact, Rajiv Kinra's work shows that it moves to a different level of discourse in Shah Jahan and later, which is it actually becomes part of the sub-imperial discourse, right? And it really becomes part, instead of it being a philosophical position and an imperial edict, it actually becomes more of an etiquette and ethic that is imbibed by the Mughal bureaucracy and nobility. And its connection to the millennium essentially becomes looser and weaker. So it does become ethicized and embodied and much more, and it begins to shape the self in some ways. And in terms of irony, the last reference to Solekol that I could find, and in some ways it sort of shows that really that the Mughal world had come to an end, was that I think it appears in Ghalib's biography written by Hali, who in the end has to describe Ghalib's religion, right? And Ghalib, it was generally known he was a Shia, but he would never sort of take a Shi'i position publicly. And in fact, he didn't want to talk about religion publicly. And so Hali says that his real religion, Asal Mazhab, was Solekol, right? And sort of leaves it at that. So you could see, I mean, if you think of Ghalib as the last Mughal gentleman, then I guess the irony is that the concept died with him, right? he was probably the last one who really understood what Solikul meant. And after that, you know, it became a meaningless term. And today, if you use it, people say, what are you talking about, right? So anyway, I thought I'd sort of tie some of the threads and leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, Milinda and then Ed.
I'll take slightly long, maybe. Maybe I'll start with Francesca's and then go to Anastasia's. That was an amazing question, and you're absolutely right. So I think with Bankim Chandra, the two things, irony and messianic seriousness coexist, but they're also in a dialectic. So for example, in his work, Hanuman Babu Shangbad, Hanuman, or the Rama's monkey god, he comes and basically makes a really ironic dialogue with a particular Western educated Babu, because the Western educated Babu is saying, now we have got self-government with Lord Ripon's reforms. And Hanuman said, what self-government? I mean, in Ram Rajya, we had self-government. And it's a very ironic sketch. But of course, within that irony, there is a messianic seriousness that this kind of liberal reform that the British are giving is not real freedom. Ram Rajya is freedom. So I think the two coexist. Or, in somebody like 1940s, 50s, the poems of Vishnu Day. Vishnu Day is, he writes a poem in 1947, very ironic, very sharp poem that we have got independence, but there is no Ram here in this Ram Rajyo, only exist crooked politicians. It's a very ironic poem, but it doesn't quite leave millenarianism, because he actually then writes messianic poems projecting Lenin as kind of this apocalyptic avatara, various kinds of peasant rebels, especially Santals and Mundas, as kind of messianic figures. So I think the two consciousnesses coexist, and I think I would really love to know more about Hindi literature, where I'm sure this probably exists as well. Maybe I don't know, Bhartindu, Arishchandra, or others. Now to go to Anastasia's question. I personally would not differentiate Hindu versus Muslim Christian thing, but think of it in a more pan-Eurasian way. So one of Norman Cohn's less read books is of course Cosmos and Chaos, where he argues controversially that it's actually ancient Zoroastrianism and Iranian state building, which was the root of Jewish Christian messianism. It was this kind of Zoroastrian kind of Achaemenid state project and so on. Now, of course, there are other scholars who have kind of argued that the Zoroastrian idea of millenarian conflict between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman is actually part of Indo-European beliefs. And the Mahabharata has been read as basically a kind of apocalyptic war. Now, I think what is common to the kind of Indian, Zoroastrian, Islamic Christian traditions is that you have this end time conflict, whether it's Kalki coming or the Mahdi coming or the Zoroastrian savior coming, and then you have the birth of the new world. Now, in the Indian case, that happens repeatedly. In the Muslim Christian case, it happens once, but actually the curve is similar. Things are going to dip, there's going to be a conflict, somebody's going to come, and then something new is going to happen. Which is why I think in the 19th, 20th century, it becomes very easy for Indians to establish equivalences. So Gandhi, in his speeches during the Khilafat non-cooperation movement, says the battle versus good and evil is something you find in Hinduism, in Zoroastrianism, because as a Gujarati, of course, Zoroastrianism is very important for him, and in Christianity and in Islam. And he says that the fight against the British is like that. And of course, he also repeatedly invokes Jesus's fight against the Roman Empire as also a political apocalyptic struggle. But also, let us say somebody like Nazrul, he compares Shiva's horn, the Bishan, which Shiva will announce Pralaya, with the horn of Israfil. And he, of course, also compares Michael, who, of course, in Islam as well as in Christianity is, the archangel, with Vishnu fighting the demons. So the reason he can establish these equivalences, I don't think is specific to the 19th, 20th century. They have very deep prehistories. So I would rather, what I find more compelling is to think about, of course, variations in traditions, but also deep Eurasian continuities as well.
That's fabulous. That's fascinating. Ed?
Yeah, I think this idea of where politics is, in Manipur, there's a real sense of secrets. This fact that these manuscripts could be hidden around and people have these revelations. There's also a sense with so much like black money flowing around. If a new building comes up in town, who has it? Where did they get the money from? How did it happen? Was it from insurgents? There's all sorts of drug money and smuggling happening through. There's disappearances. There's a whole range of secrets that make it a particular style of politics. And same with the way QAnon spread really big in Nagaland, among Naga friends, because they watch Fox TV because of shared Christian culture, etc., is the idea that there's secrets out there and there's secrets to know. And comparing with other forms of South Asian state practice, a lot of my interlocutors tried to move away from astrology because they saw it as fundamentally Hindu in the way they've been brought up. But astrology was a great technique to understand the secrets or, know what was coming. And now that they're placed elsewhere. So that would be one answer to that. And I think that the danger of seeing millenarianism everywhere, making the category too big, is interesting to try and think, what is it that really makes someone? I mean, one way is a lot of millenarian leaders didn't leave, clear followers in the kind of the classic ones from Jharkhand, Central India. Didn't, a lot of people died before they had followers, where kings are always looking to keep the line forward and thinking through, for example, the Universal Friendship Organization, when their leader died. I don't know if he's buried now, but during my fieldwork, he was kept on a hill because he was resting for 2 years and the body divinely didn't decompose. And there wasn't clear who would follow him. But I think that, if we're trying to think of a few characteristics that keep this category distinct, that's an interesting one. And looking at the categories Uday's worked with, a lot of the classical ones, a lot of the ones from the early 20th century, they have real promise of sacrifice. And that's no longer, I think as well in the Pacific world and the African world, a lot of millenarians, one of the first things they do is stop their group sacrificing, and particularly in these kind of more societies now identify as tribal. So it'd be interesting to think, what discourses have shifted to make millenarianism now, I think a greater sense of history, the social power of history has only grown in South Asia at that time. And a lot of groups, especially methods, very much about recovering a lost history. And I think that's only strengthened since kind of the classic millenarian accounts we have from the beginning of the 20th century. But possibly, that's just a suggestion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's one thing which is a kind of historiographical question that all of these comments raise for me is that, are we seeing something more now and labeling it a millenarian, perhaps kind of with an excessive zeal at times, or is it that actually there is an expansion of the phenomenon itself, in the sense that people are arguing about a new axial age? And that is, and I think that we have to, at some point in our own work, and probably more generally, we have to ask ourselves whether this is just our perception or whether there is something happening, whether, if you think of it in terms of millennial capitalism, like the Komarovs, with the implication, some of you brought up neoliberalism and the response to neoliberal globalization. That perhaps is one aspect of it. But there is also this question, and thanks, Ed, for bringing up QAnon, because there is a broad sense that even in groups that we would not normally think of as a millenarian, and we kind of see in American politics, in Indian politics, there are sects or movements where 15% of Americans, according to one Pew survey, identify the religion as QAnon. So, and that itself should cause us to take this phenomenon seriously, because the core beliefs of are not simply, and I don't know if messianic is the right word, but there is the question of the self. There is the question of a new heaven and new earth. And very frankly, Donald Trump is entirely dispensable for this kind of, he is not the Mahdi for sure, in these kinds of formations, nor is the man with the horned helmet, who is vegan and so on, and who has his own, he is the anthropologists of ethics would have a lot if they got a hold of him, to talk to him about his ethics. But I find these figures fascinating because anthropologists tend to largely stay away from the living millenarian figures. And there is a tendency to valorize the subalterns among them. And there is nothing particularly subaltern about millenarianism, if you really think about it, right? And so that seems to come out from all the things you're saying, and from Syrian Christians to the Metis clan heads and so on. And I wonder really whether in thinking about our times as a millenarian phase, just like the period that Piers was talking about between 1000 and 1033 or so that Cohn and others have written about. Whether there is something peculiar in terms of, in terms of where the times we're living in, the politics we see, and the fact that we fail to see what, people certainly 1,000 years ago would have.
Just respond to that very quickly. I think there's like a paranoid politics now that is true for it. And QAnon have a very thin view of the future. They're like, no more pedophile child sacrifice and things will get a little better. They have no like thoughts about the economy, they have no like new socialist order. The people you're familiar with, Jharkhand, they're like, throw away your plows, there's going to be a richer, better. They have a fully fleshed out utopian vision where like QAnon and some of the others, they're pretty thin. Akbar has this beautiful art. There's all sorts of, I think in other cases, it's much kind of richer. But as a utopian vision of millenarianism, they're not really offering very much. They're like, a few of these really bad things won't happen.
It's a sort of discourse of denial, isn't it? I mean, they're denying what they don't like, but they're not actually offering an alternative.
They don't have a post-millenarian vision in that sense. But at the same time, I think what is really striking is the anticipations, and that they're very strong on. They're very strong on the pre-millenarian beliefs, and particularly they have a very definite group of people they've identified as the corrupt elite, and whether and obviously talking about child abuse and so on is one way of kind of letting the label stick. But one of the interesting things for me is that, and you see it in India too, with the way the Nehruvian elite has been tarnished in a similar way. There are all kinds of ways of describing this group of people. It's no longer just about secularism, but there is a way in which, if you really want to slander these people, why not just call them pedophiles? But that's actually the least interesting kind of label, so to speak. What for me is most interesting is that there is this question about, we need to move beyond. And there is no way we are going to play the rules according to whether you call it a globalist conspiracy or whether you call it the Nehruvian secular way of doing. There is a sense that we are not going to put up with this. And there is a kind of a deep desire for an absolute break, and where the status quo is seen as deeply immoral. Because that really then goes beyond left and right and the usual forms of political discourse that we have. Milinda, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to latch on to that, Uday. I absolutely agree with you that I think globally, I mean, going beyond the left-right bifurcation, there is a deep sense that we are not living in good times. But I think, the paradox is, of course, we are probably facing end times more than, because of just the climate crisis. I mean, global warming, sixth mass extinction of species, scholars call this not just the Anthropocene, but the Necrocene, the age of death. So, I mean, obviously it is a kind of very apocalyptic moment, but we don't really see that admitted in literature. I mean, there is some apocalyptic fiction and so on, but as Amitav Ghosh, of course, reminds us in Great Derangement, that there isn't really a deep cultural engagement, that we are living in a time when the life and being of humanity as well as non-humans is threatened. But I think what's very interesting, going to exactly with you, is that there is a move that we need to go beyond. But perhaps what is lacking is the sense of community, because at the heart of all these kind of resistant millenarian movements there was always community. But now, of whatever form, but now maybe capitalist neoliberal atomization and proletarianization has spread so much that it is very difficult to think of solidarities. However, having said that, what is very interesting, I think, is to think about the kind of Antifa, anarchist discourses, various kinds of indigenous liberation politics, whether in Australia or New Zealand or the Americas and so on. Black Lives Matter, of course, and I would be very curious to read more scholarship that maybe they are actually animated by the idea, maybe not that the Messiah is going to come, but that the world is in crisis and we need to, topple this kind of extremely brutal neoliberal capitalist status bourgeois order and think beyond. And maybe one of the reasons anarchism is actually making a comeback and it is becoming admissible even in like scholarly kind of circles to talk about it is precisely because there is a sense that we need a horizon to come. But for that, of course, one needs community solidarities, which I would guess would be the challenge of the hour with this climate crisis and everything.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right. We have a few more minutes. If anyone has a question or wants to respond to something that's been said.
I would just say my interlocutors, a lot of them would quite happy if Manipur looked like Singapore in 20 years, and they would go all in for capitalism quite disappointingly. The UFO have got like a legacy of socialism, but a lot of the others, you know, what they really want to see is a sort of cosmology of fortune. So I wish I could cast them as more anti-capitalist than they are, but they'd settle for earthly riches.
Yeah, and that seems to come out for the Syrian Christian and others in Kerala, you know, from Kerala, because it does seem that, you know, not just dominant groups, but even when you look at migrants to the Gulf or Singapore, there is very active participation in you know, through commodity capitalism, but also through the images that circulate. You know, if you look at migrant TikTok in the Gulf, for example, you will realize there is the plenitude that is implied by these images, including moving images. That there is a way in which people interpolate themselves into the logics of millennial capitalism. And this is not really very different from what they're doing in mosques and churches in terms of what, you know, the prayer practices, so to speak, very closely correspond to the material desire, the erotics of desire. And I think that's why, you know, recently reading William Mazzarella's, you know, book on this issue, you realize that, you know, the digital social takes certain very specific contours. And it may be, you know, for many of us, it may resemble very weak social ties, in, you know, in terms of if you look at its sociology. But you know, it's a question that comes up for me again and again, that do we assume that there were very strong social ties in the Jesus movement or in various other, you know, were people really closely, you know, getting to know each other's overlapping lives and households? I'm not so sure, actually, because yes, there is a deeply individualist concern about salvation, but I wonder if the communitarian aspect is actually played up in many ways, and whether, but of course, at the same time, we have to admit that the digital social has certain contours, it has certain unique attributes, and what is now sometimes casually referred to as tribalization online and so on. I mean, that's also a very interesting phrase. I'm writing this paper on how, after all this time, the word tribe has come to define people in North America who are not at all native communities. And it is such a strange thing if you think about the career of the tribe in Asia and Africa and Oceania, and to come back to Europe and now, actually the tribe is in Europe. You know, that it is such a strange idea if you really think about the career of this concept. Anyone else? We have a few more minutes. I know you guys need to go.
I would like to ask one last question to bring it back to our main purpose of the project, and to see if anyone can think of any lexical surprises that you've come across when you were thinking about South Asian politics through the category of millenarianism that Uday has sprung on you.
Shakti Siddho Imam. So Imam is obviously Imam, but then Shakti Siddho, an Imam who is imbued with Shakti. So this is from Nazrul in the 1940s, talking about how the humans to come who will, you know, lead decolonization and liberation will be Imams imbued with the power of Shakti, which is one of the most greatest terms I got.
Anyone else? Do you have any terms, you know, that came up that stood out for you? Sulikul, we heard, and we had a parivartanam.
And I had absolutely no idea of the source of Allahu Akbar. Gosh.
Yeah, no, let me just say that it's, I mean, both Allahu Akbar as a form of a Mughal oath is not normally written about in such terms, but it certainly became part of, for example, Mughal chancery, instead of starting with Bismillah, actually would start with Allahu Akbar. It begins to appear on coins. And that's coinage is something that I've started to pay a lot more attention to recently, because in some ways, coins are where oaths are written. So, and it's a deep structure. It's sort of been there since the axial age, actually, when coinage was invented. So so when coinage changes, you can sort of see, you know, something institutionally changing. But Surah Kul is something that is of deep interest to me, but it's also something that, you know, once a bunch of Mughalists got together a few years ago and we were all asking about it, everyone assumed that the term had some Sufi connotations or came from, Tusi's political theory from Iran or something. No, it was invented wholesale in Mughal India, right? And it does not have a Chishti Sufi root. It does not come from political philosophy, Hellenistic or otherwise, that lived on in Iran. So that's another thing, which is it was a new term, and it was a new term created to specifically sort of mark out the Mughals from the Safavids and others who were imposing one religion. And this was to say, no, there's going to be a peace. And of course, the idea of messianic peace is behind it. So,
right.
I'll just add that I had the Langdong Lungdai that I started with, focusing on the human nature of temporality. There is a swap of generations, think in terms of father and son, compared to like a new age or new prophet's age. It's keeping that kinship idiom of generations at the center of time.
Yeah, and I'll add that parivartanam or conversions is something that definitely struck me, because in the political legal context of the Gulf, conversion or proselytization of any kind it's not allowed. If you're caught converting someone to any religion, you're deported, or usually it's deportation. But by operating within the logics of intra-Christian conversion, which in the context of Kerala at least, we see these different caste Christianities as emerging as distinct Christianities. And so when these groups use the term conversion, they quite literally mean it as conversion from one kind of religion, one kind of Christianity to another, with two very distinct caste histories. So I suppose the term parivartanam or conversion, struck me.
How interesting.
Just to quickly add to Asper's point, sorry for that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this coinage point is really interesting, because my friend Devin Singh has this amazing book called Divine Currency, where he looks at how important coinage was in kind of the early emergence of Christianity and all these messianic discussions. And to tie that with Uday's point, maybe today we actually have the messianism of currency, whether it's Bitcoin or whatever, that this kind of earthly paradise and earthly plenty, maybe that is the new messianism with having many coins.
Well, maybe that's a numismatic workshop, as I see.
Piers, you had your hand up. Yeah.
No, just a quick thing, which is, remember that the Hindutva people say that they are not converting Adivasis to Hinduism, of course. They are merely showing them their true nature as having always been Hindu, but got lost in the forest. So the word conversion, there are many kind of political contexts in which that word needs to be avoided. Not only for the reason you mentioned in the Gulf. In other words, it's to show that these are reform movements rather than anything else.
Yes. Reform and revitalization in some way. Yeah. All right. We're thank you, Milinda, for staying. I know that you had to leave earlier. But thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Anastasia, for making this happen.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you all.
Let's come back again.
Yeah. Thanks
so much, everyone.
And Milinda, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Good to meet you.